Hey guys, it's Lynn Pratt. Thanks so much for joining me to paint this rose in watercolor. Now I'm just doing this as a very simple 5x7. It's a perfect card for Valentine's Day or for any occasion, or just a really simple watercolor painting. So I'll show you the colors that we're going to use for this. So this is the palette I have. So my first color is Pyrrole Red. It gets a little bit darker with Pyrrole Rubin. The next one is Perylene Maroon. Then my next is Quin Violet. Then I have a mixed black that I haven't done 100% black. I have mixed my Pyrrole Rubin and Shadow Green, and I just, instead of doing it completely black, I just have the tiniest bit more of the red so that it's just tinted almost black, like a really, really dark maroon red. And those go up nice in color so that when I'm adding into my rose, I can go from my bright red all the way to my darkest point. And it really has a nice value change. So keep in mind that if you don't have these exact colors, as long as you start with your brighter red and then go down to your black or almost black, then you'll be just fine doing this. You don't have to have the exact colors that I'm using. Also notice I have drawn or traced my image very light. Because I'm going super light around these edges, I do not want those lines super dark. So when you are drawing or tracing the image that I've provided, make sure that you just do it with super light lines. Don't press hard on your paper. If they are too dark, remember you can take a kneaded eraser and just lift them up a little bit before you add your paint to it. I'm going to start on this bottom right hand section, and I'm going to skip around and just do each section separate, so you don't have to go in the exact order I am. So with my clear water, or well, it's tinted a tiny bit red just from rinsing out my brushes and playing with my colors, but as long as it's pretty clear, I have my wet into wet wash. So I want to make sure that when I add this layer of water, that it's pretty even and smooth and I don't have puddles, so that when I add my color into it, it doesn't all go into one area and I don't get a whole bunch of blooms. So I'm going to start in this area with just a little bit of my Pyrrole Red. This is kind of a darker area, so I actually don't have too much of my Pyrrole Red in it, but I'm going to put that where it's a little bit lighter. Then I'm going to come in with my Pyrrole Rubin, and with this I'm going to go right up to the edge of that line and right up to the top. Now because I'm doing wet into wet, I've increased my drying time, so I have a little bit longer to play around in it, but you want to make sure you go fairly quick so that you don't end up playing around in it and getting a whole bunch of blooms because your paint has started to dry. So that's adding my Pyrrole Rubin. Now I'm going to come in with my Perylene Maroon, and I'm going to add it a little bit darker over on this right hand bottom side. And right under the fold of the petal has a little bit more shadow as well as that's coming down. And I want to make sure as I'm going that I don't have any areas where I have lots of water or paint. So I can just drip off my brush onto a paper towel and make sure that I don't have areas where it's really gathering a lot. Next, I'm going to go into my Quin Violet, and I'm just going to add that right on top in this bottom right where it gets much darker, and then just a little bit right along this top edge where that petal folds down over. And over here, I'm not going all the way into my darkest black at all. It doesn't get that dark in this area. And keep in mind, I'm just doing this as a 5x7, just a simple painting card. I would be putting a lot more detail in, a lot more layers, being a lot more careful if I was doing this as a large painting that I was really trying to get to a full photorealistic style. This one's just keeping it pretty simple, getting that color in. We'll just blend it around just a little bit so that I don't have any blooms as it dries, so I don't have any puddles there. and I'm done. I have all my color in that part of the petal, and I'll let it dry. To do that section, I was using my size 10 Holbein Gold round because it was one of the larger areas. So now I'm going to switch down to my size 4 Holbein Gold round, and I'm going to come and do one of these smaller areas. So I'll pick right in here this time, and this one gets quite a bit darker. So instead, I'm not starting with my Pyrrole Red. Instead, I'm going to start with my Perylene Maroon. And again, I'm using my smaller brush because it's a smaller area, and because it is so much smaller, I don't really have to do my wet into wet wash because it is small enough. So I'm just starting with that layer of Perylene Maroon, and then I'm going to come in with my Quin Violet, and add a little bit more on top of that. Because this one gets really dark, I am going to use that black or almost black mixture that I've made out of my Shadow Green and my Pyrrole Rubin. And I'm going to add that right at this front edge where it gets the darkest. Now, if I just added this black mixture straight onto my page without the reds under it, it would appear very dark and shadowed, and you wouldn't get the depth in it. So it's really important that you don't just put the black mixture down on its own, that you always have the reds under there to mix in, to make sure that you get that vibrant dark instead of just a plain flat dark. Next, I'll skip up to this top, and I'm moving up to a size 6 Holbein Gold round, but remember, you can do this with any size as long as it's just comfortable to you for the area that you're doing. So I had a little bit of Quin Violet on that when I was doing my wet into wet, but that doesn't really matter. So again, I'm wetting my area. I'm not going 100% right up to the line. I'm leaving about 1/8 of an inch there and just wetting my area, and then I come right up to it when I actually add my color in. That kind of prevents it bleeding over the line at all. So this one is a little bit brighter, so I am going to start with my Pyrrole Red. And as I'm putting it in, you can see I go over the edge of the water, and at this point go right up to the edge of that front petal. So I'm starting with the brightest Pyrrole Red on this one, or whichever brightest red you are using. And this petal kind of goes all along the back and over to this area. Add a little bit more in there. Next, I have my Pyrrole Rubin, where it's getting a little bit darker over here, a little bit darker, and it gets lighter towards the edge of the petals. So I'm not bringing it quite to the edge, but just letting that wet into wet wash kind of do its own thing, and just letting it gently blend right up to the edge so that I get that little bit lighter around the edge. And then I will go up to my Perylene Maroon right here in the center where it gets a little bit darker. And remember, you can adjust these later. This is just the first wash of color into all of these areas. So once you get more of your petals in, you can always go back and add another layer to make it darker. It's a lot easier to go darker after than it is to come back and try to lighten out a whole petal. So be cautious on the side of being too light instead of too dark. That makes it a lot easier to adjust later. So you can see I'm just going to keep skipping around and building up in that order of color. So remember, I have my Pyrrole Red, my Pyrrole Rubin, Perylene Maroon, Quin Violet, and then I have my black mixture, which is my Pyrrole Rubin and my Shadow Green. I have about double the amount of Shadow Green as Pyrrole Rubin to get a perfect black. So if you add just a little bit more than half the amount with Pyrrole Rubin, you can tint it just a little bit more red than an actual black, so that you don't get a solid black. So I'm just going to keep skipping around and adding my colors in that order. As I'm skipping around and doing some of these smaller areas, especially for the really tiny leaves, or petals rather, I don't have to come in with a wet into wet, and I don't have to come in with all of the colors. So this is just adding a little bit of the Pyrrole Rubin and Perylene Maroon onto this little petal. Now the top of this petal has a much lighter, almost white, super light highlight on it. And that's something I'm going to come back and lift at the end. So I'm not concerned about not putting all the way up to that edge. At this point, I'm just getting my colors in, and then I'm going to come back after my first layer is on, and I can adjust that super bright highlight that's right on the edge. So I'm not concerned with it at this time. I'm just getting all of my colors and values in. As I come in and put in some of these slightly larger areas, I'm making sure always to do them wet into wet, especially these areas that curve all around and in and out of things, because that way I have that extra time to make sure that I can get nice, neat lines around the edges. It just extends that drying time and it helps blend the colors a little bit more. The smaller areas you don't need to, but the bigger areas it really just makes it a lot easier. So again, I go about 1/8 of an inch up to the edge. On this larger one, I'm going to come in and I'm going to start with my Pyrrole Red up on this side. Now this is one that has a line in the middle because it kind of has a lighter part that flops over it. So remember, I am going to come back and lift at the end. So I'm not super concerned that there's that lighter edge in there. I am still putting all of my first washes in as wet into wet, and then I can come and edit right at the end. So I'll show you how to do that at the end. So don't worry too much right at the beginning about the areas that kind of have a fold over in the leaf. Once everything is dry, we'll be able to come back and get that in better. Now I'm going to come in with my Pyrrole Rubin. It's just a little bit darker over on this side of the petal. I keep calling them leaves. They're petals. Coming in with my Pyrrole Rubin, and these are all Holbein watercolor colors. I just love how creamy and vibrant they always show up. And remember, you can always add more layers to go darker. It's a lot easier to go darker in a future wash than to try to lift out a whole petal. So just keep that in mind. So it gets a little bit darker down here on the edge. And again, I will sharpen that once everything is dry, as long as I just get in those values and steps in value while it's wet. That makes it a lot easier. So here is my Perylene Maroon. And on these big petals like this, I have Perylene Maroon over here, but then there's kind of a break in it, and I'm going to come back and use some over here as well. And remember, you just kind of want to get in and out, do it somewhat quick so that you don't end up with blooms all over when it's drying. Now I have my Quin Violet right in along this edge where it gets super dark. And just blending that out. And my paper is starting to dry, so I don't want to mess around in there too much longer. I'm just going to add a tiny bit of that black dark mixture right in next to the edge. and just blend that out just a little bit so that it's nice and smooth. And my mixture is starting to dry. My wash is starting to dry. So I want to make sure I get out of it so I don't have any brush marks and hard lines in there, and I'll let that dry. Once everything is completely dry, I'll show you how to come back and lift out that edge so you really get the feel that that petal is folding over. I have most of the little sections in, and now I'll come in and do this last large wash. And again, just going about 1/8 of an inch up to the edges with my wash of water, making sure it's all nice and smooth and even so that I don't have puddles. And adding my color into this big area. So I'm starting with my Pyrrole Red. It's really vibrant over to this right hand side. And now I'm going right up to that edge of the line. Has some more of that lighter vibrant red over to this side, but it's really bright and vibrant right over here to the right. So I want to make sure that I get that nice and bright and brilliant. And going carefully right up to that edge. And then I'm going to come in with my Pyrrole Rubin and put this right up to the other edges. Right up to the bottom. And to this side. And right now I'm using a Holbein Gold number 8 for this larger area. So you'd want to make sure that if you are using a larger brush that it comes to that really nice point on the end so you can just really get close to those lines and do nice details with it as well as those larger areas. So I'm trying to go pretty quickly here because I have a lot of colors to add in and blend, and it's winter here in Vermont where I'm painting and my heat is on, so it gets pretty dry pretty quick. So I don't have too much time to mix in all of my color where I would if I was in a warmer time of year or a more humid climate. So I need to just be aware of how dry your house is when you're doing these big washes. So here is my Perylene Maroon coming down in over the edge, and it gets darker up over on this right hand side as well, going right in up to that edge and just letting some of that wet into wet do the work as well. Kind of a little bit of a shadowed down right under there. Make sure that's all blended in nicely and I can't see too many brush marks on there. Because my center part is starting to dry, so now I have to be pretty careful as I'm putting my paint in. And I'm coming in with my Quin Violet, where it's a little bit darker. I have this little fuzz in there. I'll get that out. And a little bit more of the Quin Violet over to this left-hand side. And this is definitely drying a little bit faster than I would like. So I might have to come in and just do another wash in it, which isn't a big deal. I can just do a whole nother wet into wet wash into the whole area if I need to. So if you don't get all of your colors in or they don't appear as smooth as you would like, remember you can just come back and do another wash right over that initial wash. Let's see if I can get it blended a little bit better. And I'm gonna come in with that Quin Violet over here where it gets really dark. And again, just trying to get that wash as smooth as possible, because if you can get it all in one wash, especially for this size, just a 5 by 7. If this was a large painting, you would definitely have to do multiple washes on this. But at this size, we can usually get most of it in right at the beginning and then just have to do some touch-ups. Here I'm coming in with that black mixture where it gets darker over on this right-hand side, and just the tiniest bit into this top left. So I think that's pretty good, and I'll let that dry. My big wash is in and dry. I'm pretty happy with how it came out, but I did go over this edge just a little bit. So I'm coming in with my lifting brush, which is really just an acrylic brush. So it just has a little bit of a firmer edge, firmer bristles, and I can just lift just super gently. I don't want to mess up my paper. I just want to smooth out that edge a little bit before I come and put that next wash in. Oh, little drip there. So I'm just going to come and just smooth out that edge and just lift a little bit. And I'll wait until that lifting is completely dry before I come in and add that next layer in, but then I'll just touch up super light in these few areas that are missing. All of my initial washes are in and dry, and you can start really seeing all the folds and the depth of that rose. But here is where the fun part comes. So I have my lifting brush, which I use a size 0 Rockcliffe 250 LH. Now the important part of this is water control on the end. So I've wet my brush with clean water, but I want to make sure that I remove all excess water so that when I touch it down to my paper, I don't have a big bloom of water on there. I'm just using a very small, controlled amount of water, and I'm going to come in and lift out some of those edges. So I'm not going to lift out every single edge. That's important. You don't want every edge to be super white. You just want to lift out where it's much lighter. So the important part is when you're doing this, you come in and you lift, and then you have a paper towel ready and you blot up that excess moisture. If you leave that moisture on there, you're going to end up with just hard water lines all over your paper, and it's not going to look right. So I'm just coming in and lifting up some of those brighter edges that I really want to pop. So here's one of them. I'm just going to come out and lift out. This also helps if your washes weren't completely smooth on the edge. Coming and just lifting out that edge can just smooth them out and make them really look like a perfect petal. So you're not going to lift all the way to white. You're just lifting out some. And if you have like a small tiny little white line or an overlap in any of your edges, you can touch them up here as well. So you can see here where my two touched. It touches here, but not there or there, which is not a big deal. So I'm just going to come back and lift out. And sometimes you might not get it quite as light as you want. So lift it out and then just let it dry completely. And then once it's dry, come back and do it again. That way you don't rough up the edge of your paper so that you can really see that you've lifted in an area. So I'll just come back to that after. So here you can see I went over my edge a little bit. So I'm just going to come back and lift that out and smooth it up and really make it look like that perfect folded edge of a petal. Okay, so if you have any areas that you need to, you can just come out and touch up the edges of. Now, once I finish lifting, I'm also going to come in and I'm going to add some more darks. So I'm lifting my edges first, so I have that nice pop of those edges, and then I can come back in and add darks where I need to separate any petals or to darken up areas that didn't get dark enough. So that's why it's always easiest to go light first, because you can always come back in and add a layer, but it's a lot harder to re-blend an entire petal. So keep that in mind when you're putting your color in, just to go light first. So I'm going to keep going through and just lifting all these edges that I need to, like this, before I put my darks in. At this point, I think I have all of my areas lifted that I need to, and now I can go back and touch up any areas that need to be darker. So right here, this one little edge blends right into there. So I'll come back in, I already have my first layers on, so I can come back in with either just my Perylene Maroon or my Quin Violet and just add in that darker area that I need to, and blend it out right next to the edge. Now you want to make sure, especially if you're doing a bigger petal, you might have to wet down the entire thing first and do another wet into wet wash. But for these smaller petals, they're super easy to touch up. Now I'm just adding that black mixture and just blending it right in to that Quin Violet or Perylene Maroon that I put down first, just to darken that up to really make that edge pop right there. Okay, so I can skip around and do that. Right here maybe gets a little bit darker. This kind of goes up here. I kind of lost that edge when I was putting it in. And then just feather it out and blend it in. And remember, this is only a 5x7 image, so you don't have to go too crazy when you're putting everything in. So keep that in mind. If you're doing this much larger, you would have to add quite a bit more detail to really blend edges and just make everything perfectly smooth. But because of the size, and I'm just doing it as a simple card, I'm not going too crazy with blending everything out and making it all look absolutely perfect. I'll just play around with it a little bit, touch up any edges, take a step back and look at it and see what areas I really want to pop, that I really need them to come forward or go back, and then darken up next to those edges. So if one petal blends into another, you can just add a little bit of that darker edge there to really make them pop. So I'll go around and just do adjustments. Obviously yours will be different than mine, depending on where you need to darken or lighten. I'm pretty happy with this, so I am going to call it done. Remember to pull your tape off carefully so that you don't rip into your image. Always pull your tape just slowly and pull it away. If you pull it towards the image, if it does catch any of that paper when you're pulling it, it could easily tear out your image right across your paper. You don't want that to happen. So take all the rest of this off. And now I have my 5x7 rose. I can trim the edges or just put it down on a card like this, or stick it in a 5x7 frame, and it is the perfect gift. So thanks so much for joining me to paint this rose in watercolor. I hope you check out some of the other tutorials I have. And remember, if you post this online, make sure to tag me, because I would love to see how you've done it. Thanks so much. Let's paint.